Let's look now at female staff work issues. We see here Lieutenant Rasko from the Saginaw County Sheriff's Office. Excellent human being. Let's talk about sexual harassment and workplace harassment. You may be asked about this in your Department of Corrections interview. They might ask you, well, what is sexual harassment or workplace harassment? You need to know that, because it's a big deal with Department of Corrections. So you would say, well, it is unwanted attention of a sexual nature. Because if it's wanted, it's not harassment, right? Unwanted attention of a sexual nature. You don't want to do that. It is illegal and unacceptable. We even have signs all over the college that say that, right here. Sexual misconduct and harassment, illegal. Don't put up with it. Right? We're not playing here either. It's illegal and unacceptable, and you may expect serious sanction if you're engaging in that at work. There are two types. Two types. The first is called quid pro quo. Have you heard that before? That's Latin. It means this for that. You give me this, I'll give you that. Quid pro quo. In quid pro quo harassment, this refers to trading a job-related benefit for sexual favors. Now, most of the time, this involves a supervisor, because for the most part, your peers are not really in a position to give you a job-related benefit. Your supervisor can. So maybe, because you've got kids at home and everything, and you don't see them on second shift, you would like to go to third shift. And your supervisor said, you know what, I can make that happen for you if you can make something happen for me. We can work this out. We can make this happen. Or, maybe you need a personal day. Something came up. Some sort of exigency in your family life, and you need to get the day off, and your boss says, well, I could do that, but you need to do something for me. That would be an example of quid pro quo. Somebody that is giving you a job-related benefit, but there's a price tag attached, and that price tag is sexual favors. The other kind, and probably far more prevalent, probably the kind that you're more likely to get in trouble for, is just called hostile environment. Hostile environment refers to abusive treatment motivated by a person's sex that is not necessarily sexual in nature. This is the classic boys against the girls, or girls against the boys. So it could be behavior directed towards employees of just one sex by the other. So for example, in the criminal justice field, which is still pretty male-dominated, it would be male officers harassing female officers. Now it's gotten better, and most of your larger organizations have absolutely no tolerance for this whatsoever. But I'm going to be honest with you, if you get into smaller agencies, smaller organizations, you get north of here, you can turn back time 20, 30 years. It's still going on. Now I can tell you when I hired in, it was in a time when females were not welcome in our field. Maybe the men were threatened by it. Maybe it was the whole idea that, maybe they're not so big, bad, and tough if a female can do the job too. I don't know. But we weren't very welcome, and it was made pretty clear to us. So in my early years, I endured a lot of harassment. Back then there wasn't much you could do about it except suck it up or give it back. But I can tell you, many times I would come into the squad room, I would open my mailbox, and I would find pornography. Or pornographic items, dildos and things like that. Every deer season, I could plan on it, I would find in my mailbox usually a deer penis and testicles. Like clockwork, for about the first 4 or 5 years. Well, after the first year, I learned to ask around and figure out who had done that. and I would return the favor and I'd hang it in their locker for them. It was a nice thing about working third shift. Everybody's gone. So you mosey on into the men's locker room, you pop open the locker and you hang it there on the hook. And so, I mean, it happened. And there was a lot of stuff. I mean, I could stand here and tell you stories. I'm not going to do that. But what I did learn to do was roll with it and give it back. Or at least not let anybody know that it bothered me any. So, I'd pull out a pornographic joke or something and I'd read it out loud to everybody in the squad room. Hey, look what I got here. I'd make a joke of it, and when I was all done, I'd toss it in the trash. Dildo, hey, does anybody else want to play with this? And, that's what I learned to do. And after a while, they saw that it wasn't getting to me, and they left me alone, and they moved on to greener pastures, newer meat. Right. Other women coming in. But that's the kind of stuff we're talking about here. Now, men can be victims of sexual harassment by women. Yeah, that's true, because it's unwanted attention of a sexual nature, right? Yeah. And let's be honest, the kind of women that go into the criminal justice field tend to be a little bit more assertive anyway. So it can happen both ways, especially in our field. And we have this myth that, a man can never be sexually harassed because he enjoys the attention. He likes to be touched. He likes to be fondled. He likes to be grabbed. No, that's offensive to everybody equally. Nobody likes that. So men can be victims of sexual harassment by women. And men can be victims of sexual harassment by other men. And I'm not talking about this in the homosexual context. No, far from it. I am talking very, very heterosexual. You guys know what you do in locker rooms. You guys are harassing each other all the time, quite often in sexual ways. You see it on the sports field, the playing field, right? Maybe a guy makes a touchdown, another man slaps him on the ass. Women don't slap each other on the ass when they play sports. We'd go, whoa, what are you doing, man? Keep your hands off of me. But apparently it's okay to do that among guys. And then in the locker room, let's talk about some of the locker room hijinks and hazing rituals we see in sports and in the military. It runs the gamut from stealing somebody's clothes, and maybe even worse, pushing them out naked into the gym full of girls. Okay, maybe in certain cultures it probably does, but yeah, it's not routine, and you certainly don't see it on TV.
No, not on TV.
Have you ever seen The Office? You know what The Office is?
I do, but no, I haven't watched it.
There's this one episode where Michael does that to everyone in the office to tell them they're doing a good job with their work. So, and it's like by the end of the episode, no one does any of the work because they don't want him to slap with their ass.
Yeah, right.
When you were talking about that, just kind of reminded me of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I thought it was fun.
Well, we digress.
All I can keep thinking about is the jokes.
But let's go back to the practical joke that boys play on other boys, that men play on other men. You take a guy's clothes and hide them, and then push him out in the gym in front of all the women. Funny, right? Except, you know what? It's not. And in fact, that can get those guys into a lot of legal trouble, because frame it this way. What if that boy, instead of being pushed, had gone out on his own naked like that? Can we clearly see that this is sexual harassment and inappropriate behavior? Because he did that. Well, now he's not the one doing it, but somebody else did it for him using his body. How is that any different? How is that any less inappropriate, right? So you got that stuff going on. Some of the other locker room hijinks. Snapping a naked person with a towel, leaving welts on them. Let me see, what else are some of the other things that I've heard? Super gluing a person's buttocks together.
Oh, that's different.
What about icy hot jock straps?
Icy hot in the jock strap, yep, there's another one. Super gluing a man's penis to his testicles. I could go on. But if you haven't seen this yourself directly, You've probably heard of this stuff. And this is what we're talking about, sexual harassment. This is, would you agree, a hostile work environment? That's real hostile, isn't it? Not cool. So anybody can be a victim of sexual harassment by anybody else. The key here is that it is unwanted attention and somehow of a sexual nature or motivated by that person's sex, even if it's not sexual in nature. Is that clear for everybody? So if they ask you in an MDOC interview, you would be able to respond to them, right? Yes, I know what that is. Okay. This is one that surprises a lot of people. Third parties nearby can be harassed by overhearing offensive exchanges by other parties. And this is probably the more common place where people get in trouble, especially people in criminal justice. Now you might say that's not right. You might say that's not fair. But folks, it's the way it is. So let's say that Jacob and I are colleagues. And Jacob says, hey, I just heard the funniest off-color story. You want to hear it? I'm like, oh, hell yeah. So he's telling me this off-color story, and somebody comes into the room and happens to overhear this private conversation that we are having, and they are offended by it. We're going to get in trouble. Even though we weren't talking to them, we're going to get in trouble now because this third party overheard it and was offended. It's the world we live in, folks. So what I'm going to tell you is be really careful who's around when you're talking to them, because we get a lot of volunteers that come into corrections. We get a lot of people that are working in areas other than custody. They're not wearing the uniform. They're coming in from other fields, and they might have sensitive ears. So be aware of who is around you. You know, and before you share an off-color story, always make sure the other person really wants to hear it too. Okay. So Jake was smart and he said, do you want to hear it? And I said, yes, I do. Right? That's always the way to save your butt for this before you go sharing a story. But make sure that you know who's around you. And if there's somebody around you that you're not sure about, you know, take it somewhere else. Because this really happens. This really happens. Happened actually to a friend of mine out here at Delta College a while back. He's not here anymore. Actually, he's passed away. But he taught over in the science division. And in the science division and math and some other places, they have what they call peer mentors. Are you guys familiar with peer mentors? It's where a student who is really good at that subject agrees to help the teacher, tutoring students who are not so good at that subject. So that means that the teacher is going to have a little bit different relationship than the normal student-teacher relationship. They're going to be a little bit closer. So anyway, my friend, this particular teacher, would go to the fitness center and work out. And he had, you know, the typical middle-aged spread. And he was funny because whenever he saw attractive girls, he'd suck in his gut. And you could see it. It was funny. We used to rip on him about it all the time. So she was one of the sign-in people at the desk, this peer mentor. And he comes in, and, you know, she checks him in and everything, and a pretty girl walks by and he sucks in his gut. So she ripped on him a little bit. She said, I saw you do that. You know, so he gives her a little playback, you know, a little one-liner back, zings her back. So she zings him again, and he zings her back, you know. And it was just a couple of people having a good time, zinging each other with one-liners. Everybody's playing. Nobody's doing anything to harass anybody. Right. So she zings him a real good one, and he says, bite me. A third party overheard that, and he wound up with a letter in his file because it has a sexual connotation. Right. Bite me refers to biting a sex organ. Right. And you might not know this because we throw it around so commonly nowadays, but the word suck actually has sexual connotations. Right? It's referring to a particular activity, sucking, a particular thing. Right? So you have to be careful. I fell into this trap myself. You know, I was playing with one of my colleagues in the hall, and he was bragging about this wonderful trip he was going to be going on, and he was telling me how warm it was going to be. You know, it was just before Christmas break or something like that, and he was ripping on me. I'm like, man, you suck. a third party overheard that. Another faculty member who came storming out of his office and said, "I'm very offended by that." Oh. Well, watch me backpedal, right? Because I don't need a letter in my file. Gosh, I am so sorry. I didn't mean to offend you. It wasn't intended to be offensive. Please forgive me. Wah, 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 boo, hoo, hoo. Because that's what you got to do, right? Straight up. So he was offended. I had to apologize. And fortunately, I appeased the gods and I didn't get in any trouble. But, it made me pretty cognizant of who I say what around here, too. And so things aren't generally so touchy in correctional facilities or in law enforcement in general, but we're back to the idea that we've got volunteers coming in, we've got people from the outside community, that we've got people in other fields and other areas, treatment personnel, that we need to be cognizant about when we speak, okay? So keep yourself out of trouble there. Now here's another big one. Dating relationships gone bad. You've all seen this happen in your place of work, right? You know how ugly that can be. So here's my personal advice. Don't fish from the company pier. Or as a colleague of mine used to say to her employees, don't get your honey where you get your money. In simple terms, pick a uniform of a different color. If you're wearing a brown shirt, go find a blue one. If you're wearing a blue shirt, find a brown one or a green one. Now, the problem can arise, of course, if you're working for Department of Corrections when everybody's all gray. At least find somebody from a different shift, right? Because when that dating relationship goes bad, did I say when? I think I did. When that dating relationship goes bad, then here you are working in close quarters with somebody that you hate right now. And it just gets ugly, and it can even lead to lawsuits. Right? Accusations of harassment and lawsuits. You don't want to go there. So just don't fish from the company pier. Right? Look somewhere else. Courts. Should your case make it to court, maybe you get sued, courts use what is called a reasonable person standard to determine harassment. Now, we've talked about this standard before. A reasonable person is the average, regular John Q. or Jane Q. citizen, normal people. Here's where people in criminal justice can get in trouble. Because what is reasonable in the criminal justice family is generally not so much out in the community. Because the long and the short of it is, we work in a very earthy profession. We're dealing with a lot of adult situations. We use a lot of adult humor. We use a lot of dark humor. We say a lot of things that in other circles might be considered wildly inappropriate, but we typically find to be very funny. And here's where we can get in trouble. Because with you and your colleagues, that was a funny thing. With that third party or whoever else overheard that, it wasn't funny. And when the courts are looking at who or what is a reasonable person, they're not going to the criminal justice community and picking the jury from our brothers and sisters in uniform. No. They're picking from society at large, who might, in fact, not find what you said or did nearly so funny. Harassment, then, is determined by the perception of the target, not the intent of the aggressor. Let me say that again. Harassment is determined by the perception of the target, not the intent of the aggressor. And I know people that have gotten in trouble. They say, but I didn't mean anything by it. I was just playing. Well, that might be, but that's not how the target took it. That's not how the person who did that took it. And this is where people get in a lot of trouble. This is where stuff goes to court. Does that make sense? I don't want anybody getting in trouble here when they get out there in the uniform. If you feel harassed, Be an adult and tell the harasser to stop. Don't be a whiny little child and go, because the harasser might not even know they did anything. Right? They don't have ESP. They're not psychic. Probably are psychotic.
So they could be psychotic.
Yeah, they probably are. But they don't know. They don't know that they did something, probably. Especially in our field. Okay, I'm going to tell you straight up. I promise I'd be straight with you. We play rough. We play really rough with each other. We're like a bunch of brothers and sisters. How many people get sibs? Right? You know how it is. We play rough with each other with our siblings, especially if you got like boy sibs. Right? Yeah, okay. We play rough with each other. We're like a bunch of brothers and sisters. Now, we will lay our lives down for each other. We will die for each other. But we fight like cats and dogs, too. And we fight nasty and mean, just like sibs. We stab each other in the back, and we badmouth each other, and we gossip, and we're catty, and we're shitty little people to each other. That's just the way it is. It's the nature of the beast. Because we're working in such close quarters. So we play rough. And what somebody might not think anything of might upset you. True story. I had a colleague, honestly, I don't know what his thing was. He was kind of a weirdo. But I had a colleague who came up behind me one night. I'm booking an intake, and you know, the counter's about yay high or so, and I'm doing some paperwork. And this goofball comes up behind me and starts dry humping me. What are you doing, fool? You know, knock it off, you know, and I kind of pushed him away. I said, don't do that. Did I tell the harasser to stop? Okay, but here's the thing. In our field, because we play rough with each other, it might not take the first time. And sometimes you have to be persistent because they don't get it. Oh, she can't possibly mean that because, you know, hey, we're colleagues, we're friends, we're brothers and sisters here. She doesn't really mean that. And that is, in fact, what happened in this case. Happens in many cases, in fact. So a few months later, same thing, you know, I'm writing a report, that silly fool comes up and she starts dry humping me again. Like, for Pete's sake, I thought we had this conversation. Knock it the hell off, you know, and I give him a little bit of a shove. Punctuate my point. Ha 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 ha, he laughs it off and everything, so yeah, okay, you know, I'm thinking we might have to revisit this again, and sure enough, about a week later, does it again. Like, this time though, I just went, wham, and I hit him as hard as I could with my elbow in the solar plexus. And then I turned around, I looked at him, I said, God damn it, I said, leave me alone. Well, then he gets offended. And this is straight up what's going to happen to you. I'm going to tell you this right now. They're going to get angry with you. They're going to get offended because, hey, you should have wanted that. They were just playing with you. They didn't mean anything by it. And now you're going and getting upset and taking offense to it, and you're being a whiny little kid. And what is wrong with her? What is wrong with him that he would react that way and reject me? Right? Because it is a rejection of sorts, isn't it? And we all know that stings. And that's what you've just done. So they are going to be angry about this. And you know what they're going to do for about a month? They're going to run around and badmouth you to anybody that'll listen. Because that's what we do. Yes, yeah. Head shaking over here, yep. That's what we do. We love each other, we'll die for each other, but man, oh man, are we mean to each other. Anybody that'll listen. And you know what? After about a month, it'll die down. They'll forget about it, and you'll be friends again. If I can't even count how many times I've been through that cycle myself, personally. Right? Somebody did something, you know, that was way out of bounds, and I drew the line in the sand and said, don't do that. But, you know, I mean, it has to be repeated several times sometimes. Another true story. We had a black female state trooper come into our booking and intake area. And another male officer stands there and he looks at her. But he looks at her like this. He looks right at the one breast and then at the other. He's going back and forth, pointedly staring at her chest. So she finally looks at him and says, what in the hell are you doing? He says, well, I'm just wondering. Wondering what? Do those give white milk or chocolate milk? I know, right? I know. I mean, we're like way over the top here. I mean, I couldn't even believe that he said this. Well, I'm going to give her props because she could have gone to my supervisor, our supervisor. She could have gone to her supervisor. She could have started a range war between the state police and the county, but she didn't. She grabbed that fool by the front of his shirt and laid him over the counter backwards. So he's like this. And then she starts with the finger. Don't you ever speak to me like that again! If you ever speak to me like that again, I will effing kill you! He turns white. She let him up and backed away. Do you understand me? Uh-huh. And you know what? Never happened again. And she let it drop. So I'm going to give her a props. I'm not advocating violence, okay? I'm not. But sometimes to make our point, we have to make a point. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes you just do. We're brothers and sisters. We play rough. Most of the time, this is where it ends. We have a little saying in criminal justice, what happens on the shift stays on the shift. That means we take care of our own dirty laundry. We take care of our own business. It doesn't need to go any further. We're going to handle it. And most of the time, your sergeant will. So if you can't handle your own business, maybe you really do have a fool that's giving you a hard time, then go to your supervisor, okay? If the action stops, you don't need to do anything else, and that's usually where it ends. But if it persists, report it to your supervisor. The exception would be, of course, if it were your supervisor doing this, then you would go to their supervisor. But mostly, our sergeants are pretty good. And they know the dynamics within their work group, and they'll handle stuff. I had one sergeant who, if you were fighting with a colleague, you would either be assigned in a squad car, on a transport, or in booking and intake, or D, all of the above until you two made up. And believe me, you made up real fast. In close quarters like that, shift after shift after shift, you made up. Usually didn't take more than a week. Most of the time, it doesn't go any further. But occasionally it does. A harasser may be subject to discipline, civil suit, or even prosecution. When it gets here, it gets messy, it gets ugly. Now, there was a case, this was a long, long time ago, back in the late 80s, where there was a female state trooper that came onto a post, and she was riding with a male state trooper, and the male state trooper reached over at some point in time and pinched her on the inner thigh, which I think we can all agree is pretty hands-off.
Right.
Now, we're not having this conversation, right? What happens in CJ 130 stays in CJ 130, but I'm thinking when I heard about this, if it had been me, I'd have just hauled off and hit the dude.
Me too.
Right? What's he going to do? Going to run to the sergeant and say, she hit me? Because the sergeant's going to say, well, what'd you do first? But she was new, she was young, and she wasn't used to the way that we play with each other, and that was off limits, that was out of bounds, and she should have done something. But what she wound up doing was filing a formal complaint. The media picked it up. Then all hell broke loose. So yeah, there was a civil suit, and I think that she won, it was at least a declaratory judgment, and the trooper got reassigned to another post. But after that, nobody wanted to work with her because she was labeled as a snitch. So she wound up leaving the field. I'm not saying that what she did was wrong. I'm just saying that we play rough. And you need to pick your battles and how you want to fight them. And that's all I can say about this. Do we even have to go here? Sexual harassment or sexual activity with inmates? Do we even have to have this discussion? This is kind of in the duh category, isn't it? The same harassment laws govern inmates. Now you learned about this when we talked about PREA. You know, the Prison Rape Elimination Act legislation. You can't make fun of people. You can't make sexually related comments to people like that. The same harassment laws govern inmates. Sexual relations with inmates is illegal. Flat out. It's a 4-year felony. You want your introduction to corrections? There's a good way to get one. It's illegal, even if it is consensual, because guess what? It's not. You know, the inmate says, yeah, I'll meet you in the broom closet. That sounds like a good idea. Well, guess what? It's still not consensual because you have power over that inmate. Anytime you're in a power position over somebody, it's not consensual. Because you have the power as an officer to make an inmate's life miserable. You can really screw them around. So that is not consent. There is no consent whenever there's a power relationship. So we could go back to don't get your honey where you get your money and put it in these terms. This is not the way to do it. And yet, in every agency I've ever known of, there's always some ding-dong that has to go and do this. They get involved with an inmate. Sometimes it's a female officer and a male inmate. Sometimes it's male officers with female inmates. You read about the officer from Bay County and what he did. Crazy stuff. I knew that guy too. Like, in what universe would you think that was okay? Right, to slip a female inmate a camera and tell her to take pictures of herself and her cellmate in various positions without clothing on. In what universe would you think that was okay? But it is potentially a 4-year felony, and I don't know about you, but I would not want to be on that side of the bars, especially not for a prisoner. Right? Now, all right, we'll do the math here. We'll do the math. If you get sexually involved with an inmate, we're talking about $1 million piece of tail, okay? To put it plainly. I'm going to say million because I don't do math. But we'll go back to, let's assume on the very low end, as a corrections officer, you make $50,000 a year. This does not count benefits, overtime, anything. So that's a very low number. You work 20 years, there's your $1 million, right? Now, I personally have never seen anybody worth $1 million. If you have, please bring pictures to class. We would all like to see that. I can't imagine anybody, especially not an inmate, that would be worth throwing that away for. I can't even get my head around it. Female COs in men's prisons. Not the big deal it used to be, but it used to be a big deal. Until about 1982, women were not allowed to work in men's prisons. So Maria Gazar, who came and spoke to our class, hired in, I believe, 1980, I think was what she told me. When she hired in, she was not allowed to work in the prison. They put her in the tower, they put her in perimeter security, they put her on the front desk, they put her in the control room, but she couldn't actually work in the prison with the men. Now imagine that you're a female officer trying to build your career, you'd like to promote, become a sergeant, all of that, or have opportunities for overtime. All of those things are going to be denied to you because of the limited number of positions that you can work, which is what makes this really unfair. So discrimination on the basis of sex alone is prohibited. You can't do it. The only way you could discriminate would be based upon what they call a BFOQ. BFOQ. Who knows what BFOQ stands for? BFOQ. Anybody? BYOB. BFOQ. Need a better marker. Anybody? What do you think the Q is? What? Qualification, we'll go with that. All right, so the Q is a qualification. What's the O? Occupational. All right, that leaves us with the BF. Not boyfriend, not best friend. What? Oh, thank you. I get ahead of myself. Well, we'll define a BFOQ as an occupational requirement necessary for performing the job. So the BF is going to be bona fide. What does what bona fide means? Let's see. Corey is bona fide. Is that a compliment? For Corey it is, isn't it?
Couldn't it be like something you've done before, I guess?
That'd be a good guess, but not what I'm looking for. Bona fide, like the real deal. Yeah, real or actual. A real or actual occupational requirement necessary for performing the job. So not just something that you made up to exclude a group of people. So for example, until, don't take this to the bank, but until I want to say maybe the early 1990s even, the state police, for example, had height requirements. And that's what they said. Okay, now wait a minute. Why does your height have anything to do with your ability to do the job? And as it turns out, it doesn't. And what it was doing, it probably ended in the 80s, but what it was doing was keeping out a lot of women, Hispanics, Asians, right? People who tend to be smaller. It was keeping those people out. And is it necessary to be, 5'8" or 5'10" to do a particular job? Well, not ours. Turns out it's not. Now, firefighting. They're not going to say, well, women can't do this job, but what they are going to say is the physical standards for this job are here. And you must meet these standards whether you are male or female. And because the physical standards are so high, it's probable that most females will not be able to make those standards. Right? Because we don't have the same level of muscle mass that men have. And I'm going to tell you what, I'm glad those standards are there because